My name is Heidi Mercer, and I'm the proud superintendent of Lake Orion Community Schools. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Along with myself, I have Andrea Curtis, who's going to be our host and expert this evening. She is our assistant superintendent of business and finance. And this actually request came from our survey that we conducted in the spring. And so more people, which I'm glad, want to know more about public education and how it's funded, which again is a very important topic and very timely. Every year, and I think Andrea will cover this, a lot of this information has to do with our legislation, and each year it seems to become more and more challenging. So it is critical that our community understands how public education is funded.
And thank you all for your interest in this webinar and attending this evening. I know it's a beautiful day and a lot of activities are happening, so we do appreciate your attendance. A couple of housekeeping items. I'm going to try to get through this information in these slides in about 20 minutes and allow us to have time to address any questions. I want to be respectful of everybody's time, so we will conclude at 7. But if there is interest and people have additional questions, I'm happy to go on beyond 7. That being said, if you do have questions, please use the Q&A feature within the Zoom meeting, as we will not be calling on individuals. This presentation will be recorded, and we will share this presentation with the community, the slides, in the near future. So, Mark, if you could share the slides. Great. Hopefully everybody can see this. So again, to put some names, here's our introduction and the individuals that comprise the Lake Orion Business Office, the Director of Business and Finance, Shannon Hoyna, Tisha Shornack, our Payroll Coordinator, Caitlin Lingberg, our Accounts Payable Coordinator, and Trisha De La Rosa, our Accounting Coordinator. Regarding our agenda this evening, the goal is to provide a high-level overview of school funding and our normal operating expenses. So we're going to talk about how schools are funded, the budget process, the funds that Lake Orion Community Schools has, while focusing particularly on the general fund, which is our normal operating procedures, and moving into Q&A and then conclusion of the webinar. So moving into how schools are funded. The most significant funding we received is what I'm going to address on this slide. There are other sources which we'll touch on later, but this piece in particular represents over 60% of our general fund revenue and is mostly talked about with school budgets and on the news. So when you hear the words state aid, foundation allowance, per pupil funding, these are all common terms meaning the same thing. Currently, our per pupil funding is at $10,000 and $10,050 per pupil. That is made up of 18 mills in local property taxes. These are taxes on non-homestead properties. So that is not your principal residence, it's businesses or secondary homes. And then the other piece is made up of by the state school aid fund. The state school aid fund in and of itself could be an entirely separate webinar. But just so that you know, that's obviously at the state level, Michigan, they collect sales tax, income tax, the state education tax. You hear lottery tax a lot, although I will point out that's only 6% of the state aid budget. So those are the funds that make up the school aid fund, which in turn funds the districts. How our funding works, I'm sorry, if you could go back real quick, Mark. We have a pupil count, and it's a bit confusing, but we look at pupil count based on FTE, or full-time equivalent. It's not based on head count. And what that means, so say for example, we have an ill student and they only come to school or they only receive the education 60% of the school day. In that instance, Lake Orion or any district would only receive 60% of that per pupil funding. Now, our FTE is combined of two separate count days. We have a count day in the spring, which is February. We receive 10% of that count, and then 90% of the FTE count, which occurs in October or the fall. The important thing to note here is, for example, in our current fiscal year, which I should mention, we are on a June 30 fiscal year. So for the one ending the end of this month, we are talking about 10% of the count from February of 25 and 90% of the count from October of 25. So to put this in perspective, as an example, let's say we have 6,800 FTE. That's combined the 90% plus the 10%, and we multiply that by the per pupil funding. That would equate to a little over $68 million in total. Of that, we're receiving a little over 12 million from local property taxes, and then the school aid fund makes up the difference of a little over 56 million. Okay, then moving into the budget process. This is a continual cycle, but when it starts each year is in February, typically when the governor presents the budget proposal. From there, we kind of have an idea of what our revenue funding will look like. So we begin to develop our budget forecast. And what is a forecast? Well, typically we look out 3 years is ideal, but it is based on a number of assumptions. But this really starts our process for the next fiscal year. And then this February also, or that February timeframe is also when we have the first student count, which will make up 10% of next year's budget. Then in April, we've got the state and the House that typically present their budgets proposals. Again, it kind of it just gives us an idea of where things may be headed on a revenue standpoint. So we continue with our budget forecasting during this time, and actually even well before, we may be dealing with contract negotiations based on our unions and what those terms are going to be looking like going forward, as well as looking at our pupil count forecast. So where do we think our pupil count is going to come in the coming October? What we see right now is declining enrollment based on our graduating class being much larger than our incoming kindergarten class. So we take that all into account. We also look at birth rates to kind of determine what our incoming kindergarten class is going to look like, which all helps develop our revenue budget. May, June, the state, the legislature is negotiating. They're trying to determine what the budget is going to be approved at. Now, I say approval with a question mark because as we saw last year, they're required to have a proposal by July 1st, but we actually didn't receive that proposal. They didn't sign on it until October, obviously well into our school year already. So we as a district and all districts have to have an approved budget by June 30th. Going into the next fiscal year. So obviously again, I've mentioned it, we are basing it on a lot of assumptions at that point. And we don't have all the answers going into our fiscal year. So we determine numbers based on what we know best at that time. In September, October, as we get started into the school year, we're typically in the full swing. We know where our staffing is. Where our students are coming in at. So we start to work on our amendment. So we approved an original budget in June. We know we have to amend it based on known facts. of where the budget, hopefully at that time, is approved. And we can kind of solidify where the revenue is going to be coming in and what our expenditures are looking like. At that time is also when we have that fall, that October pupil count. So we'll know the other portion of our 90% of FTE. And then that just continues throughout the year. So November, December is when we're shoring up, I like to say, or essentially finalizing what our amendment is going to look like, which goes to the board typically end of December, early January. And again, it's a continuous cycle. So we will do a final amendment, and often we are talking 2 different fiscal years at the same time, concluding one, starting another one. Moving on, as I've mentioned, I think we are going to focus on the general fund here, but we do have a number of other funds that we account for certain activities in. We follow governmental accounting standards. So we have our general fund, we have our capital projects funds, which is our sinking fund, as well as our 2018 bond that we're still under construction. And we have Series 3A and 3B still outstanding. We have our debt service funds. These are voted proposals that we pay principal and interest May and November. And we also receive the tax revenue on all properties to fund those principal and interest payments. We have an internal service fund, which is where we account for our self-insurance. We are self-insured for dental. The community service fund houses our early childhood programs as well as enrichment services programs. Our food service fund is specific to student meals and providing those free lunch and breakfast that we currently have. And then our student activity funds, which are our internal student and building funds. So think clubs, athletics, any fundraising that you may see with children. These are the funds that house those dollars and expenses. So to focus on the general fund going forward for this presentation, what are normal operating operations? What types of expenses? And we have a prescribed chart of accounts. So where we have to charge certain things. These are our objects. So staff salaries, benefits, purchase services, supplies, capital outlay, dues and fees. And I'll get into those in a couple, some more particulars in a couple more slides. The functions of our general fund are plentiful. We have our basic programming. That's our K-12 classrooms. We have our added needs, which are our special education students. It could be our vocational education students. We have pupil supports. These are what we call our ancillary supports. So our speech pathologists, our counselors, our social workers, our instructional support, which is professional development, and then kind of the more obvious ones are general and school administration, business services, human resources, operations, transportation, communications, pupil accounting, technology, athletics, and some community service items such as rentals. So to provide Lake Orion specific information and a little bit more detail on revenue, this is actual data from our fiscal year ended just last year, June 30th, 2025. We recognized approximately $108 million in revenue. As we previously talked about, over 60% of that revenue is that per pupil funding. Obviously, you can see here in the graph, 77% of our revenue comes from the state. So that other percentage or the other revenue that's there are what we, or what I call categorical grants. But what are categorical grants? They can be restricted or unrestricted, but they are all provided by the state. For example, we received funding this past year for professional development. We received funding for early literacy. So those are restricted grants to be spent on those specific purchases or operations of the education. And then there's also some unrestricted, and that would be the state provides a pot of money and we can apply that towards retirement costs as those are significant. The local revenue, the 12.7%, as you can see there, is the property taxes, the 18 mills that was already discussed, interest, athletic event admission and pay to participate, rentals, transportation, services, and tuition. The interdistrict and other revenue at 7.7%. Interdistrict essentially means between districts or between the local intermediate school district. So the largest portion of that 7.7% is PA18 special education funding. The county has a millage and they have the center-based programming for special education students that's run through that. So we receive funding through that PA18 funds. And it could be any other payments from another school district or the ISD. Sometimes there's additional grants that we receive through the ISD specifically. And then we have our federal revenue. These are restricted grants. We refer to these as our Title I grants, or I'm sorry, title grants. It could be Title I, II, III. They all have student-specific needs or professional development needs. So we have to comply with the rules of the grant. And then one of the bigger ones is the IDEA grant, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. We receive grant funding there that goes specifically to our special education programming and students. Another one, just as an example, the title grants and the IDEA are typical from year to year, but there are often initiatives from one year to the next. One this year was the Filter First grant. So in order to provide safe drinking water, the federal government provided these funds and we track those as federal revenue. Moving on to our expenditures. Again, this is as of June 30th, 2025. We had about 105 million in expenses. And this pie graph shows the expenses by object. So salaries and benefits, as you can see here, that is the majority of this pie, right? It makes up over 83% of our expenses is in staffing costs. And I always point out that it's actually higher than that because if you look at the costs that are under purchase services, we have substitute costs, we have custodial costs, and we have other contracted staffing costs. So really, those are staff costs too. We report them under purchase services versus salary and benefits because they're contracted. So I would say that that portion of wages is actually much higher than 83%. So that you know what goes into purchase services, all functions of what it takes to operate daily, software licenses, professional development costs, tuition, utilities, copier charges, audit fees, legal fees, postage, phone, repairs and maintenance, district insurance, and even bus leases. Those all fall under that purchase service category. Under supplies and materials, as you can see, we have teaching and testing supplies, textbooks, library media. A supply is also considered our natural gas and our electricity charges, bus fuel, and transportation supplies. And then the other category. So if we had any significant capital outlay, that would be there. Dues and fees for, say, memberships, tax payments, and payments to other public schools or the special education center tuition. So if we send some of our students to center programs, that's where that expenditure is recorded. So a big topic is always transparency, and we are actually required to be very transparent. As you can see in the circle at the top, there's a box around a pop-up that if you go to the Lake Orion website, you're going to see this transparency icon pop up. If you click on that, it's going to take you to a page which you can see on the right-hand circle of the page where it drops down, and there are a number of items that we are required to post, being our budget, our expenses, our policies, our registers for what's been paid, our check registers, and compensation information. That is all there. As well, annual audits. So every year we are required to have an audit. They look at our internal controls. They look at all of our expenses. When you have a sinking fund or a bond fund, that is also a part of it. They're looking that we not only are accurately reporting the information, but that we're also complying with the rules and regulations of those funds. So that was a lot of information quite quickly. I don't know if there are any questions or answers at the moment. You can, the QR code, you can scan that. If you have any further questions for us that we can answer, or maybe it's even if you have an idea for future topics, we really look forward to providing more financial webinars like this, addressing specific topics, knowing full well it's a lot of information and probably a little bit foreign. So even if you have questions later on that you think of, please feel free to post those, and we will be developing a question and answer document that we will share with the community. So if there are no questions, I don't see anything in the Q&A. Thank you for your time tonight. We did end a little bit early in anticipation if there were any questions. But again, please feel free to reach out. My contact information is there. And we look forward to more webinars.